The herd slept beneath a vast sky where stars flickered like fragile embers of forgotten fires. The narrator whispered, "The night is not gentle. It waits with patience sharper than teeth." A calf stirred, its breath misting in the cold air, unaware of shadows moving beyond the tall grass. Elizabeth said, "Stay close to me, little one." But silence answered her voice. The predator moved unseen, each step a thread of death woven into the stillness. James said, "The wind hides him, the dark feeds him." A storm brewed on the horizon, its rumble masking the faint rustle of paws. The narrator pressed, "Survival does not knock. It tears open the door." Stars shimmered above, but below, death crouched low. The calf blinked, fragile and slow, life trembling on a fragile thread. Nature does not promise dawn to all who sleep beneath its sky. The narrator said, "The herd sleeps, but death walks." Elizabeth's ears caught the rustle, her body tightening with instinct older than memory. She whispered, "Stay near me." The calf pressed against her cloak, trembling. Around them, the herd breathed in oblivion, their heavy sides rising and falling like ocean waves. But shadows stalked the rhythm. James lingered at the edge, patience carved into his every motion. Lightning split the sky, and for a heartbeat the predator's shape was drawn across the land. The calf blinked, innocence unready for the world's cruelty. Elizabeth whispered again, "Not tonight." The narrator said, "Every breath taken in the wild is borrowed time." Above, stars burned indifferent, watching as silence grew sharper. The storm deepened, thunder rolling like drums of war. Elizabeth's eyes cut through the grass, her heart quickening. The narrator said, "She knows the shadow comes, though the herd does not stir." James crept forward, crouched low, his breath slow and controlled. He said, "Hunger waits for no dawn." The calf shifted, eyes wide, fragile bones trembling against earth. The herd continued in sleep, blind to the predator's hunger or the protector's fear. Lightning flashed, white fire chasing shadows for an instant. Elizabeth whispered, "I will not lose you." The narrator said, "The night is a balance between love and hunger, survival and loss." Stars flickered faintly, dimmed by the storm's violent approach. The narrator said, "Every silence in the wild is broken by the sound of pursuit." James crept closer, his outline hidden by storm-dark grass. His muscles rippled under faint light. Elizabeth leaned forward, her breath shallow, hands steady against calf's trembling frame. "Stay still," she whispered. The calf shivered but obeyed the cloak's shadow. Thunder rolled above, masking the predator's step. James said, "Patience feeds me." The narrator pressed, "The storm hides him. The night carries him." Lightning flared, predator and protector revealed in one violent frame of fate. The herd stirred briefly in restless dreams. Silence reclaimed the night. The herd sighed in their sleep, but Elizabeth's heart thundered with the storm. The narrator said, "She feels death move, though no hoof stirs." The calf pressed into her, breath shallow, its innocence carved in trembling silence. James crouched lower, every step slower, eyes locked with hunger sharpened by patience. He whispered, "Closer." Lightning flashed again, burning predator and prey into a single violent canvas of nature's truth. Elizabeth whispered, "You will live." The narrator said, "The wild is no place for promises, yet they are made in defiance of death." Stars flickered faintly, blurred by clouds, while wind pulled at grass like claws. The silence stretched, heavy, unbearable. The narrator said, "The wild tests its children with fire before they learn to walk." Elizabeth's arms tightened around the calf, her breath uneven as dawn teased the horizon. She whispered, "You are not alone." The herd shifted, restless with unseen fear. James lingered at the edges, his hunger tethered by patience, but his eyes never left the calf. The narrator pressed, "The innocent carries the weight of tomorrow." Elizabeth's heart pounded, torn between love and dread. The calf lifted its fragile head, blinking into the dim light, unaware of the danger that stretched beyond its small world. Silence returned, sharp as the cold air, broken only by the beating of survival's drum. The narrator said, "Every bond in the wild is carved from fragility." Elizabeth traced her hand gently along the calf's back, feeling bones so slight they might snap under the world's weight. She whispered, "Grow strong, little one." James remained hidden, his eyes burning with hunger that would not relent. The herd shuffled, uneasy but still bound by sleep's weight. Above them clouds thinned, and morning light crept in, fragile as the calf itself. The narrator said, "To love in the wild is to defy the silence that waits with open jaws." Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly, pressing her forehead to the calf, vowing without words that she would endure. The narrator said, "Hunger watches, but hope lingers." Elizabeth guided the calf toward the herd, steps slow, careful not to wake others. The calf stumbled, fragile legs trembling, but pressed forward. James whispered to the dark, "Weakness invites me." Elizabeth turned, sensing eyes on her though the grass concealed him. She whispered, "Not while I breathe." The calf pressed closer to her leg, its small body radiating warmth against the cold dawn. The narrator pressed, "The herd shelters many, but the heart protects only one." In the silence between breaths, the line between life and death grew thinner. The narrator said, "Every protector carries the burden of fear." Elizabeth halted, eyes fixed on the shifting horizon. The calf leaned into her, head low, breathing fast. She whispered, "Do not fear the dark, fear only giving up." James lingered, crouched in silence, gaze locked on the bond between protector and child. The herd stirred uneasily, sensing unrest. The narrator pressed, "What binds them now is fragile thread. Love stretched thin against hunger." A crow cut across the sky, its cry echoing like omen. Elizabeth pulled the calf tighter beneath her cloak, her resolve harder than the storm itself. The narrator said, "The anchor of survival is not strength, but love." Elizabeth knelt, eyes locked on the calf as the herd moved slowly past. She whispered, "You will see tomorrow." The calf shifted, resting against her, tiny frame quivering. James crouched farther back, hunger gnawing but restrained, the shadow waiting for weakness to unfold. The narrator said, "Every promise made in the wild is written against death's silence." Elizabeth lifted her head toward the fading stars, her face carved with exhaustion, yet fierce. Around her, the wild roared in silence, a battlefield disguised as morning calm. The narrator said, "The wild does not rest, it sharpens its claws at dawn." Elizabeth pressed forward with the calf, her steps urgent, each rustle of grass a warning. James moved closer, his shadow a wound creeping along the earth. He whispered, "Hunger grows with patience." The herd stirred, uneasy, their movements fractured by instinct. The calf stumbled, its thin legs trembling. Elizabeth said, "Stand, little one." The narrator pressed, every step taken in weakness invites a predator's strike. Wind swept across the plain, bending grass in violent rhythm. Elizabeth's eyes caught motion in the dark. The storm's weight still lingered, heavy and merciless. The narrator said, "Nature raises the stakes with each heartbeat." The herd began to scatter, their circle breaking under fear's command. Elizabeth tightened her grip on the calf, her voice sharp. She said, "Stay with me." James stepped forward, closing distance, his presence radiating inevitability. The calf stumbled again, nearly falling. The narrator whispered, "The weakest must run, yet they cannot." Elizabeth pulled harder, her body tense, eyes locked on danger. Hunger stalked them in silence, every breath a countdown. Thunder cracked faintly, echoing the storm's memory, while the plains trembled with the clash of predator and prey's fate. The narrator said, "Every breath draws danger closer." James crept low, each step precise, his body blending with swaying grass. Elizabeth's chest tightened, her eyes fixed on him through the shifting stalks. She whispered, "I see you." The calf pressed harder against her leg, its small body quivering with terror. The narrator said, "Predator and protector meet in silence before the storm of struggle." James flexed his hands, hunger gnawing deeper with each pause. The herd had vanished into distance, leaving Elizabeth alone in the widening field. Dawn's light fell across her face, pale but unbroken, defiant as steel. The narrator said, "Conflict rises when the world offers no escape." Elizabeth stood tall despite trembling legs, her cloak torn by wind. She whispered, "You will not take him." James bared his teeth in a cold grin, his hunger bound only by timing. The calf stumbled again, collapsing to its knees, breath ragged. The narrator pressed, "Innocence bends, protector breaks, predator waits." Grass swayed wildly, scattering dust like smoke. Elizabeth pulled the calf up with fierce resolve. She said, "Stand, we endure." For an instant, dawn's light cut across all three, revealing the fragile line between survival and loss. The narrator said, "Survival sharpens to a blade in moments like this." James advanced with deliberate steps, his eyes locked on the calf. Elizabeth stood firm, her body shielding the fragile creature. She whispered, "You will live through me." The calf's breath shook, each exhale a plea against inevitability. The narrator pressed, "Every conflict cuts deeper when love resists hunger." Wind screamed through the grass, carrying dust across the plain. James said, "The end is near." Elizabeth answered with silence, her eyes blazing with defiance. The world around them held its breath, waiting for the strike. The narrator said, "What we fear may carry its own scars." James stepped closer, his hunger undeniable, yet his eyes flickered with something deeper than cruelty. Elizabeth's body tensed, ready to shield the calf, but her breath caught as she noticed the limp in his stride. He whispered, "I hunt because I must." The calf pressed against Elizabeth, trembling, unaware of the revelation unfolding. The narrator pressed, "The predator too bleeds, the shadow too carries chains." James lowered briefly, his hand brushing his side where old wounds marked survival. Stormlight revealed his truth. Danger and suffering were bound in the same skin. The narrator said, "Truth cracks the mask of fear." Elizabeth's gaze sharpened, seeing not only predator but survivor. She whispered, "You carry your own battle." James snarled, but his eyes betrayed fatigue. The calf pressed closer to Elizabeth, heart racing, innocence unable to see the layers of conflict. The narrator pressed, the wild binds all with the same thread of need. James straightened, his hunger undimmed, yet his shoulders heavy with scars. Elizabeth's voice hardened, "You and I fight for the same reason." Silence followed, broken only by wind bending the grass in uneasy rhythm. The narrator said, "The enemy is not evil, only inevitable." James lowered his head, his voice a whisper, "Hunger does not forgive weakness." Elizabeth stood taller, shielding the calf. She said, "Nor does love." The calf raised its head, eyes wide, sensing the collision of forces beyond its understanding. The narrator pressed, "The wild has no villains, only stories of survival etched into flesh." Lightning faded from the storm, leaving silence in its wake. For a heartbeat, predator and protector shared the same grief, both fighting a war written by nature itself. The narrator said, "Revelation does not end danger, it deepens it." Elizabeth's eyes locked with James, her voice trembling yet firm. She said, "I see you." James growled softly, torn by hunger's demand. The calf shifted, pressing harder into Elizabeth, trusting her warmth. The narrator pressed, "To know the shadow's truth is to suffer its closeness more deeply." James' jaw clenched, his scars glowing faintly in morning light. "It," Elizabeth whispered, "but I will not surrender." The plain stood still, every blade of grass holding its breath as predator and protector stood on the edge of decision. The narrator said, "The hidden truth reshapes the battlefield." James stepped back slightly, his hunger unchanged but his resolve fractured. Elizabeth exhaled, her body loosening only for a moment. She whispered, "You are not alone in your pain." The calf raised its head, blinking at both figures. The narrator pressed. Even predators carry wounds, even protectors fear collapse. James turned his head, his scars carved deeper in dawn's light, yet his shadow remained. The plain echoed with silence, heavy with the knowledge that both stood as survivors, bound by cruelty of nature, destined for collision. The narrator said, "The wild does not forgive hesitation, it demands blood." James lunged forward, his hunger no longer restrained by scars or silence. Elizabeth stepped into his path, her cloak whipping like a banner of defiance. She whispered, "You will not take him." The calf stumbled behind her, its legs weak, breath frantic. The herd thundered in the distance, running from fear they could not see. James growled, his body driving closer, each step heavy as a death knell. The narrator pressed. Every predator meets its truth in the moment of collision. The wind howled, grass tearing apart as if the earth itself braced for impact. The narrator said, "When survival strikes, time fractures into heartbeats." James leapt, arms outstretched, his shadow falling over Elizabeth and calf. Elizabeth raised her arm, bracing for impact, eyes blazing with fury. She shouted, "Not while I breathe." The calf cried out, collapsing onto the ground, too fragile to flee. The narrator pressed, "Innocence cannot run, it must be shielded." Dust exploded as James landed, claws of hunger tearing the earth. Elizabeth staggered but did not fall. Lightning from the fading storm ripped across the horizon, illuminating predator, protector and prey, locked in one breathless frame. The narrator said, "The climax of survival is a storm of bone and will." James crashed into Elizabeth, his weight driving her back, but her body held firm like stone. She gritted through pain, whispering, "You cannot break me." The calf whimpered, small legs trembling, pressed flat to the ground. James snarled, teeth bared, but his breath faltered under strain. The narrator pressed. Predator bleeds when prey refuses surrender. Elizabeth shoved with sudden force, her cloak snapping like wings in the wind. For an instant, James staggered, the scars of his past tearing open in the clash. The narrator said, "Every battle breaks something, even in victory." Elizabeth's arms trembled as she pushed James back, her body near collapse. James roared, lunging again, his strength brutal, scars splitting under strain. The calf cried, voice sharp as the wind. Elizabeth whispered, "Stand behind me." The narrator pressed, "Love is strength only when it bleeds for another." James swung, striking her shoulder, forcing her to one knee. Pain carved into her face, yet her eyes did not yield. Dust rose in choking clouds, as if the earth itself tried to bury the moment. The narrator said, "The essence of survival is not winning, but refusing to surrender." Elizabeth rose slowly from the ground, blood marking her shoulder, her cloak torn to rags. She whispered, "You will not have him." The calf pressed closer, fragile but alive, shielded in her shadow. James staggered, his hunger unbroken, but his body faltering under its weight. He growled, "This is not over." The narrator pressed, "The climax does not end hunger, but it crowns love with fire." Wind roared, stars faded into dawn, and the plain trembled as two survivors clashed in merciless silence. The narrator said, "When the storm ends, the silence weighs heavier than the roar." Elizabeth stood with trembling arms, blood on her shoulder, the calf pressed close. She whispered, "We still stand." James staggered back, his breath ragged, scars torn open anew. The herd returned slowly, watching from distance, their eyes wide with unease. The narrator pressed, "Victory is not triumph, it is survival carved in pain." Wind calmed, carrying dust away as dawn spread across the plains. Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly, exhaustion heavy, but she did not fall. The calf shifted against her, alive, fragile, breathing. The narrator said, "Resolution is not peace, it is the weight of what remains." Elizabeth lowered her hand to the calf, stroking its trembling frame. She whispered, "You are safe for now." James collapsed to one knee, growling softly, hunger unbroken but body defeated. The herd shifted closer, cautious, their circle reforming with hesitation. The narrator pressed. The protector stands, but not unscarred. The predator falls, but not erased. Wind died down, leaving only shallow breaths and silence carved across the plain. Elizabeth's gaze lifted to the fading stars, her eyes dark with the memory of the fight. The narrator said, "Every victory echoes with loss." Elizabeth pressed her forehead against the calf, her breath unsteady. She whispered, "We will see tomorrow." James turned his head, his eyes dim but not lifeless, hunger smoldering beneath pain. The herd's hooves shifted nervously, the ground trembling under their unease. The narrator pressed. The wild writes no endings, only pauses between struggles. Dust settled, leaving the battlefield etched into memory. Elizabeth exhaled slowly, knowing safety was a fragile illusion. The calf blinked, innocent, unaware that life's gift was borrowed from death's hand. The narrator said, "The end of struggle is not silence, but reckoning." James rose slowly, his breath heavy, his body broken but alive. He whispered, "This is not my end." Elizabeth turned, her voice steady despite fatigue. She said, "Nor is it mine." The calf shifted closer, clinging to her warmth. The narrator pressed. Predator and protector walk away carrying the same burden. Survival at any cost. The herd resumed grazing in wary silence, their circle fragile but whole. Above, the sky cleared, dawn burning away the last of the storm. Yet the earth still smelled of fear. The narrator said, "Resolution does not choose sides, it carves its truth into all." Elizabeth stood with the calf beneath her cloak, eyes burning with fatigue but fierce resolve. She whispered, "We endure." James turned away, limping into tall grass, his figure swallowed by light and shadow. The calf pressed closer, its breath calming, body trembling less. The narrator pressed. "The wild gives nothing freely. It takes its spares, its scars." Dawn spread wide across the savannah, illuminating both predators' retreat and protectors' defiance. The silence that followed was not peace, but the weight of survival itself. The narrator said, "The wild leaves echoes, not endings." Elizabeth stood beneath the vast morning sky, her cloak torn, her body weary, yet her arms wrapped firmly around the calf. She whispered, "We are still here." The herd grazed nearby, their circle whole again, though shadows of fear lingered in every glance. James was gone into the tall grass, but the weight of his hunger remained like a ghost. The narrator pressed. Survival scars echo louder than victory. Wind moved softly now, carrying scents of dust and blood, a reminder of what had passed. The calf blinked, small breath steadying against her side. The narrator said, "Echoes linger in silence more than in sound." Elizabeth lowered her face to the calf, pressing her cheek against its head. She whispered, "You are the proof we endured." The calf leaned into her, fragile yet alive. The herd's movements steadied, their fear replaced by rhythm of survival. The ground, once torn by struggle, now lay quiet, scars hidden beneath grass that swayed softly in morning wind. The narrator pressed. "The earth remembers the fight even when the eyes look away." Elizabeth closed her eyes, her breath slow, her spirit etched with fire. The narrator said, "The echo of survival is carved into every breath." Elizabeth straightened slowly, her shoulders heavy but unbroken. She whispered, "The stars bore witness, the dawn carried us through." The calf stepped shakily but stood beside her, its body steadier than before. The herd grazed in silence, rebuilding calm on a battlefield unseen by others. The narrator pressed, "Every life carried forward is an echo against extinction." Wind swept across the plain, bending grass that once hid shadows. Elizabeth's eyes lifted to the horizon, seeing not safety, but the endless march of trials yet to come. The narrator said, "Every echo carries a memory, a warning, a hope." Elizabeth turned toward the herd, guiding the calf gently back into their circle. She whispered, "You belong with them." The calf moved hesitantly, but its steps grew stronger under her watch. The herd shifted, accepting the fragile survivor into their rhythm. The narrator pressed. The herd sleeps beneath stars, but wakes beneath scars. Elizabeth paused, her eyes catching the horizon where James had vanished, his shadow swallowed by tall grass. The silence spoke louder than roars, reminding her the battle was never truly gone. The narrator said, "The final echo lingers in the silence after the fight." Elizabeth stood still, the calf pressed at her side, both staring into the horizon where the predator had vanished. She whispered, "We endure, even when death waits." The calf blinked, fragile but alive, its breath slow and steady. The herd grazed behind, their circle whole once more, yet marked forever by fear's memory. The narrator pressed, "Nature is not cruel nor kind, it is absolute." Stars faded from the sky, leaving only dawn's light, carrying the unshakable truth. Survival is never promised, only borrowed.